I'm anxious to hear what you have to say. I heard a very interesting young man, Marcus Stinson. He's somebody that you'll want to hear.
Okay, I don't know.
He is now in Frisco, Texas. He's West Virginia, all West Virginia up until he's going to move to Texas.
Okay.
And, but he's somebody that is as brilliant a young man, and I think he may be able to write, so you may want to.
I mean, the need to.
Yeah, he's going to speak 2 or 3 more times. I think he speaks 3 times. And, is it time to start?
I think it is. I think it is. So you can.
Well, I guess it's time to start. If there's anybody outside that's going to come in, now's the time to do it so we can get started. It is my pleasure to get to introduce Greg Tidwell to you, and he'll be talking about preparing for the next Great Awakening. He's been doing a good bit of research in years past of some of the earlier Great Awakenings within this nation. And I think he's going to have some great things to share for us today. We had talked a little bit about his topic, and I was excited to hear it, and I know that you are excited to hear it. Greg Tidwell has served as the editor of the Gospel Advocate for a number of years, and we are so delighted to have Neil Anderson with us and his lovely wife, and they invited him into that role, and he has kept it for all of these years. Greg is a lot of things. When I first met him, he never slept, and he ate coffee beans, and I never could understand that. You know, he was that kind of guy. Greg has been probably my closest preaching friend since we met in 1995. He is a person that I have great confidence in. He is like a brother to me in more ways than my own brother. And we have been very close for a very long time. I don't know if there's anybody that I have greater confidence in to do the work that he's doing with the Gospel Advocate than Greg Tidwell. And he has been the kind of individual who has been a true brother to me and opened up many doors for me, and I was thankful for that. We worked in a number of projects together. We both serve on the board of Lads to Leaders, and Roy Johnson, who is the director of that, is here with us today, and we're thankful for him and what he means. If there is anybody that is known in Ohio, any preacher for the Churches of Christ, right now it's Greg Tidwell. He's probably the best-known preacher of the Churches of Christ in Ohio. He's been with Fishinger and McKinney for 30-plus years. They love him there. He is a leader in the state, a leader in Columbus, a leader for the truth, a leader for young people. One of the things that I am a little jealous about Greg is how much he has stayed with children. Now, I have a lot of children in my family. I have 12 grandkids. But he is somebody who loves children. His work with Fort Hill Youth Camp, he still goes, he still participates. His work with so many things. With that, he organized a group of young people who were young ministers and others who work with young people. He's the kind of guy that if you want to ever leverage anything, he will help you find a way to do it. He loves the Lord. He is devoted to God. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you my dearest friend, Greg Tidwell.
Well, Phil, thank you so very much. And you mean a great deal to me, and so many of you who are here have friends who are connected through my work in Ohio and with the Gospel Advocate. It's such a blessing, and thank you for being here. We are looking at the topic, preparing for the next Great Awakening, and I'm going to have to be glancing back occasionally just to make sure that I'm moving along. And if I get off, if you'll signal to me, that'd be great. But as all right, I'm not moving forward. All right, why am I not moving forward? All right, I'm stalled. Nothing's happening. So we will continue preparing. We want to consider the Great Awakenings in American history. And as we touch on this topic, there are two times that are known as Great Awakenings. The first Great Awakening was in the 1730s through the 1750s, and the second Great Awakening beginning in 1790 and going to 1840. Now, in looking at this, we in particular should have some interest in these events because the American Restoration Movement was really a part of the Second Great Awakening in terms of a historical event. And so there are many things that we touch on with that do reflect on our history as a movement. Now, whenever we look at the Great Awakenings, we find that they had political and societal implications. For example, the American Revolution really, in a very major way, was a product of the First Great Awakening. The names of Jonathan Edwards and Whitfield, others, were national names a full generation before Washington and Jefferson were on the scene. And so part of our national identity came from that. And then, of course, the Second Great Awakening really, in a very major way, paved the way for the abolition of slavery, the events surrounding the American Civil War. These are part of our history. And yet, while there were societal and political implications, neither of these events were fundamentally political. Rather, they were religious events that would have political impact. In particular, they were involved in a practical engagement. Unlike previous religious movements that really involved the hierarchy and the structures of religion, the First and Second Great Awakening fundamentally were engaged in reaching individuals, having people make a decision to change. And rather than being top down, they were bottom up, engaging individuals, and they were, in that sense, populist. Again, you look back at previous changes that came into the religious world, and they were changes that occurred on an institutional level. But within the First and Second Great Awakenings, what we really found were individuals who, had I done something wrong with it?
Probably not, it's been acting up.
Oh, my goodness.
Try it now, this button should advance.
Move me forward. Very good. Thank you. Up, it does jump. It is populist in that rather than just dealing with the ivory towered guys, the people who were at the top of the hierarchy, it was dealing with individuals and changing the lives of people. Further, it was bringing about a new worldview, a different way of viewing life. It engaged people in such a way that they were transformed. And we see this in so many different ways. Now, the First Great Awakening brought about a change in the way people viewed their lives before God. One of the big shifts that occurred in the First Great Awakening was a recognition of grace, the idea that God was reaching out to them. The Second Great Awakening brought about a change in the way people viewed not only their relationship to God, but also the way they viewed one another. The fact that they believed that all human beings had a responsibility before God to treat one another humanely. As a result of the Second Great Awakening, you find an entire spectrum of social programs that came into our society. The humane treatment of the mentally ill, penal reform, the child labor laws, the idea that children needed to be protected, and of course, very notably, the abolition of slavery. All of these things came from a different way of looking at life, of recognizing that God had called you to be a different person. Now, when we think about the Great Awakenings, we often focus on some of the more spectacular, I guess is the only way to describe it, events that occurred. Now, in the First Great Awakening, you had the way of salvation presented in such a way, so graphically, that people literally would be holding on to the edge of their pews because of the graphic way in which hell was being depicted. The most famous sermon from that era of the First Great Awakening was Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And he begins that sermon describing the idea of being on the precipice, being about to be pulled into the pit of torment. And it was in such a graphic way that people were engaged by it. Now, the Second Great Awakening went even further, and the spectacular displays that occurred. The great meeting at Cane Ridge in the Second Great Awakening, where Barton Stone and others were preaching. People had very unusual displays whenever they would come under conversion. Some of them would get what were called the jerks, where they would just be twitching away. Others would become catalytic and fall over. That was referred to being slain in the Spirit. By the way, if they did that on a hill, they would sometimes roll down the hill. Those were the holy rollers. And of course, my favorite are the ones who would drop down on all fours and start baying like a hound. They were referred to as treeing the devil. Well, you look at all that, and that's kind of wacky. It's kind of weird. Sometimes, in looking at all of the spectacular events, we forget that there was a doctrinal and intellectual foundation for the Great Awakening. You begin looking at the First Great Awakening. Jonathan Edwards was a towering intellect. He was a theologian. He was not a carnival sideshow preacher. He had a foundation he worked from. And you move into the Second Great Awakening, and yes, they did have things that were going on the frontier, but you've got to remember a major part of the Second Great Awakening was a revival that occurred in the Ivy League schools. Timothy Dwight was the president of Yale. And he was concerned because church attendance in the United States had reached the lowest ebb it's ever been at. Whenever people think in terms of our history, they sometimes forget that following the American Revolution, church attendance dropped to below 10% of the population. People weren't going to church. There was some thought that Christianity would be completely eclipsed in the New World. And Timothy Dwight was concerned. And so he held a special meeting at Yale. And he called all of the student body and all of the faculty together into their chapel. And he preached to them. And he told them that they needed to change or they were heading to destruction. And there was a revival. They were convicted. There was an intellectual underpinning that we find in the Great Awakenings. Now, we need to recognize that they did have some unconventional methods that were part of all of this. Okay, there we are. You begin looking, and in the First Great Awakening, there were two things that were quite different. We don't think of them as different today because they worked and we kept doing them. But did you realize that the idea of Sunday school did not exist before the First Great Awakening? It was in Georgia, where John Wesley was serving as a missionary, that the first program that we would identify as a Sunday school came into existence. And it was fabulous. Now, again, we think of it as, well, that's just what churches do. Well, they didn't do it before then. It was an innovation. And it was fabulous. The other thing that was unconventional was open-air preaching. Now, we recognize, of course, going all the way back to the day of Pentecost, where Peter was preaching in a public setting, but that had become very unusual. Preaching was, in those days, confined to a church building. But George Whitefield would go out and he would preach to tens of thousands of people. By the way, some folk disputed the numbers that were being reported. You know what a preacher count is. You say that an auditorium is comfortably filled, and that means everybody has room to lie down. So the account of there being tens of thousands of people, Benjamin Franklin didn't believe it. He didn't think a man could preach and be heard by that. So he went to see for himself. And he did a head count and calculated, and yes, there were tens of thousands of people. And not only did Ben Franklin hear George Whitefield preach, he was convicted enough that when they passed around the plate, he put some money in it, which, think about Ben Franklin, kind of, thrifty fellow, he was moved. But the idea of open-air preaching, of unconventional methods, we begin looking at what they did. And with all of this, in both the First and Second Great Awakening, they engaged youth. Now, in the First Great Awakening, it was done in a way where the presentations would very often speak to young people. Second Great Awakening, we find that there were youth meetings, there were things to gather youth in, but a focus on young people. And this is something that we can see that brings about the change in life. Once again, in both the First and Second Great Awakening, it was not from the top down, but it was engaging individuals. And when you engage young people, you are leveraging them over time. You change a teenager's outlook, and that change is going to influence the church for decades. Whereas if you convince a church leader, an elder, or a preacher, well, that man may be in his position for 10 or 20 years, but that's it. The focus on young people, engaging youth, and transforming them in their outlook was important. We see also with the First and Second Great Awakening that there was evangelization of both the churched and the unchurched. This is important because sometimes we make the mistake of having one message that we are presenting to the outside and a different message that we present within our church buildings. Now, do we need to recognize that those who are outside of the church perhaps have a different outlook? They need to be given baby steps to get there. Yes, of course. But the fundamental message is not different. In both the First and Second Great Awakening, you find that the first step they took was to evangelize those within the church. Think about Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Where did he present that? Well, it was not to the outsiders. It was to his congregation. We need to recognize that members of the church need to be revived. There needs to be revival. And the power of revival is in the message of Jesus Christ. We need to make sure that we are putting forward Christ and Him crucified. We need to make sure that we are convicting our members of the truth so that they'll be motivated, but also to reach out to those around us. We must not ever hide under a basket, but we need to be very clear. And we need to recognize the use of media. Media in the late 1700s, early 1800s is a little bit different than media today. But they used media. They used the printing press. Jonathan Edwards' sermons were read by far more people than ever heard him preach. They used the tools at their disposal. We also need to take care of using media. Now, we must never permit media to take the place of the clear and personal presentation of the gospel. This past year, I've spoken with several, in fact, a couple of you that are here today, about what we've dealt with this past year, and I think we may have made a mistake in the way in which we packaged the staying at home. I believe it is appropriate to stay at home if that is what you need to do. Those who are providentially hindered, to use the old term that we bandy around, absolutely, we understand. But we must never give the impression that it is all right to stay home and not meet with the saints. And I'm afraid we perhaps went over the top in making people feel good about staying home and we didn't let them know, well, really, this is an accommodation because circumstances require it, but as soon as you can be back, you ought to be back. The use of media can never take the place of human interaction, of a man standing in a pulpit preaching. It can't take that place.
Amen.
Now, having said that, we should be using the media to the extent that we can and recognize that in the past it amplifies the good work that has been done. And then we find that it does bring a consolidation into a new framework. I've already mentioned the Sunday school program. And the very idea of talking about Sunday school as if it's an innovation, that's almost silly. Well, everybody has a Sunday school. Well, it was new at some point in time. The first and second Great Awakenings, both of them, were iconoclastic. They jarred people. And the ones who were entrenched in positions of power opposed them very strongly. However, once they've had their effect, they had to be consolidated into new ways of doing things. In just the same way, we need to be very mindful of the gains that we can make, and we need to bring these in and give them longevity, help them to move forward. Now, all of this, and I know that we've been drinking out of a fire hose, so there's a lot of information. But as we move forward, let's see, there we go. As we move forward, there are 4 points that I want to leave with you, and the first is to manage expectations. And I use that term guardedly because there are two extremes. Ira North, in his perennial bestseller, Balance, highlighted the fact that in church work, you've got to avoid extremes. Expectations. There are two extremes. First of all, there is the danger of not having expectations. You know, you just show up, you're a pew potato, settle in, get your card punched. You're there a couple of Sundays a month. Maybe you come on a Sunday night. Once, okay. We've got to be careful. There needs to be a level of expectancy in the Lord's church. We need to be looking forward to the future. We need to be engaged and recognize that God has great things He can do among His people. Now, to a certain extent, that was true in the First Great Awakening, even more in the Second, where there was an expectation. Timothy Dwight, for example, set out on a mission. He wanted to see revival there in New England. And he wanted that, and he got it. Now for us, in our congregations, what do we want to see? What is our longing? Are we longing to see the boys and girls growing up in our congregation to be vibrant men and women of faith 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Do we want to see the lost that are around us brought to the Savior, coming to know the Lord? Do we want that? But we also need to manage our expectations. There's always the danger of letting the absolute become the enemy of the possible. of becoming so fixated on the ideal that you forget what is really doable. And you must never permit yourself to become so enraptured with what could be that you don't do what you ought to do here and now, step by step. We also need to prepare the intellectual framework. Doctrine matters. And our congregations will flow downstream from our convictions. What we believe will change what we do. And if you really want to make a difference, you need to make sure that you are convicting your members with the truth of the gospel. We need to prepare the intellectual framework. I am a strong proponent of working with young people in the Lord's church. And there are things we do with the youth that are just fun. By the way, I like having fun. There's nothing wrong with that. Having a pizza party or playing a game, those are great. But in working with our young people, we need to make sure that we are developing in them an understanding, a Christian worldview. This is one of the reasons I am a tireless supporter and promoter of the Lads to Leaders program. You look at that program, now, is it fun? And the answer is, yeah, it is. But there's content. Within our congregations, we need to make sure that young people, as well as those who are not so young anymore, are receiving content, that the Word of Christ is dwelling in them richly. Because in Scripture, we find the answers to all the pressing issues of life. We need to balance change and continuity. We need to be very careful. Alexander Pope, in his essay on criticism, had the famous couplet, "Be not the first by which the new is tried, nor last to lay the old aside." We look at how we do things, and we need to be careful. We shouldn't just throw everything out and reinvent the wheel every cycle. But on the other hand, there are things that do change. We need to make sure that we are engaged in our society and that we use the tools at our disposal. Brandon Edwards has been so involved with the Harbinger Seminary. And you look at the work they are doing, and it's not a brick and mortar seminary. It's online. It's different. There is some change that has happened, and yet there's also continuity. The substance has not changed. And then lastly, we need to get back there. Oh, it disappeared. It's gone. We need to target points of decision both in and out of the church. Ultimately, we need to be calling people to make decisions. In the church, we need to call them to greater faithfulness. Whatever they are doing today, the question should always be, what could you do more? How can you improve? And for those who are not in the church, obviously, the point of decision, the hinge on which everything turns, is the question of whether or not they believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Are they going to be a Christian? We need to be moving people to a point of decision. One of the great lessons that we draw from the first and second Great Awakening is that ultimately it is individuals who make a choice. And this choice changes the way they live their lives and the way in which their religious life together, their congregations, will move forward. If we want revival and restoration in the Lord's church today, we need to focus in on individuals and call people to make a choice of following the Lord more authentically than they have before. Thank you all very much, and that concludes my lesson. And we're the blue screen. Well, thank you, Aubrey. I appreciate you being here. How are you doing?